Good morning, everybody. My name is Mac Clemens, and I'm joined by Heather King, your SLA support manager, and we're here to talk about accessibility. Say hi, Heather.
Good morning, everyone. We're glad you joined us.
All right. So we're so delighted to have so many of you here about this very interesting topic. And just a few ground rules before we get started. You are welcome to ask questions at any time. Heather is monitoring questions throughout this webinar, and we'll also be recording today's webinar. So if you'd like a copy later, or if there's anything we cover, we're going to be covering quite a bit of material. We can always send that to you later. So just keep all of that in mind. And so today, we're going to cover four major areas. First, we're going to talk about why is accessibility important. Second, we're going to talk about what is Section 508 and what is WCAG 2.0 AA, both mouthfuls. And I'm sure these are things you've heard about, but if you want to actually know what they are, we're going to get into that. We're also going to talk about the new requirements in detail and January 18th and what happened with that, with the law. And then we're going to get into how to check. So how to evaluate your website's accessibility. So that's our goal for today. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. Why is accessibility important? We're actually going to cover this in a brief video. This is a video, it's 4 minutes long. And this is produced by the World Wide Web Consortium, and it talks about accessibility. And we don't normally like showing other videos, especially when they're just slightly corny, but this one has been done very well, and it gives a nice background on accessibility standards. So I'm gonna go ahead and play it now.
Hi, my name is Shadi Abu Zahra. I'm the Accessibility Strategy and Technology Specialist at W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And today, I'd like to tell you about web accessibility. The web is for many people an essential part of daily life, at work, at home, and on the road. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web equally. For example, somebody who cannot use their arms and uses a mouse stick to type, or someone who cannot hear well and uses captions to watch videos, or someone who cannot see well and uses a screen reader to read aloud what's on the screen. Accessibility has many benefits. For example, captions benefit anyone in a loud or in a quiet environment, and good color contrast works better when there is glare. Also, people with age-related impairments, such as reduced dexterity, benefit. In fact, everyone has a better user experience with an improved layout and design. A lot of accessibility can be built into the underlying code of websites and applications. Web technologies from W3C, such as HTML, provide support for many accessibility features. For example, features to provide text alternatives for images, which are read aloud by screen readers and also used by search engines. Also, headings, labels, and other code supports accessibility and improves the quality overall. Good authoring tools, such as wikis, content management systems, and code editors, help create accessible code, either automatically or with input from the author. Also, web browsers, media players, and apps need to support accessibility features. W3C provides standards to help make the web accessible, which are internationally recognized by governments and businesses. Most well-known is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. WCAG is also ISO standard 40500 and adopted in the European standard called EN 301549. It is built around four core principles. First, perceivable. For example, so people can see the content or hear it. Operable. For example, so people can use the computer by typing or by voice. Understandable. For example, so people get clear and simple language. And robust, so people can use different assistive technologies. Besides WCAG, W3C also provides the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, ATAG, which defines requirements for content management systems, code editors, and other software. And the User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, UAAG, defines requirements for web browsers and media players. There are over 1 billion people with disabilities, or around 15 to 20% of the population. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities defines access to information, including the web, as a human right. Most countries around the world have ratified this UN Convention, and several have adopted binding policies too. Yet, regardless of any laws and regulations, implementing the accessibility standards is essential for people with disabilities and useful for all. For more information on web accessibility, visit w3.org/WAI.
All right, so that is the video from the W3C. And we have enormous respect for the W3C. They do an outstanding job, and because they publish things like the HTML specification, they're absolutely sort of the worldwide authority. And so everything that we reference today is going to be talking about those international standards. So now this might lead to the question, what is Section 508? So Section 508, it's technically part of the US Rehabilitation Act, but it's referenced by ADA. And this is sort of the US version, or the US ratification, if you will, of those global standards. So it requires public organizations to follow accessibility guidelines, and even private organizations would face liability if inaccessible. So a really good example of this is actually Target. So Target back in 2007 was sued for not having an accessible website. So they were using Flash and other things at the time that couldn't be surfed by users who were blind, and they were not able to check out without using a mouse. And so it led to a lawsuit that was ultimately settled, but that became kind of a watershed moment because Target was actually very committed to accessibility, but they didn't include the web in their strategy, and they settled for what's rumored to be millions and millions of dollars to settle that. So it's quite substantial. And so what's exciting, Section 508 basically had its own guidelines leading up to January 18th, where they switched from having sort of their own regulations, which were defined in the Rehabilitation Act in Section 508, to just aligning with the international standards. And so WCAG 2.0 AA is basically what we just heard described. Those are the World Wide Web Consortium, and they're similar. Section 508 often, it now will point to WCAG 2.0 AA, but it also, they're similar requirements, but the WCAG ones, while they're a little bit harder to meet, are so much clearer and so much easier to understand. And the standards actually range from level A, which is the lowest, to level AAA, which is the highest. And Section 508 actually just references AA as the new requirement, and that's pretty much the gold standard. AAA is very complicated to do. We're actually building a AAA site right now for Disability Rights California, which goes live at the beginning of next month. And we learned a lot in the process of what it means to build a AAA site. So it's not for the faint of heart. I definitely think AA does more than meet requirements. So the January 18th date, so you might have heard this, and this is when Section 508 officially started pointing to WCAG 2.0 AA. So technically, to be Section 508 compliant, you just need to be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant, and you're fine. But an interesting provision that got thrown in kind of after the fact is that it actually only applies to new sites that are launched after this date. So significantly changed sites, such as a redesign or other things. So if you have an older site and you didn't redesign it since January 18th, you technically only need to meet the older legacy Section 508 guidelines. So today we're going to cover WCAG 2.0 AA in detail, just so you're aware of the modern standards, and we're going to show you how to test for both. So if you have an older site that was redesigned a few years ago, you can technically skate by on just Section 508 guidelines, but we want to make you aware of the newer guidelines because you would be required to meet them if you redesigned your site. You may be required to meet them regardless in the future, and they're just good to know. All right, we're keeping an eye out for questions, so feel free to jump in at any time. So now we're going to get into the requirements in detail, and we're going to walk you through each of the 4 areas that he talked about, starting with perceivable. And so these are actually broken into different sections. So there's section 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the dots indicate the different requirements within each one. And we're going to give you detailed illustrations so that these all make sense. Because if you just go to read the spec, it's supposed to be accessible and easily understandable, but it's actually kind of complicated. And it's so abstract because it doesn't only refer to websites, it refers to applications and all kinds of things, PDFs. It's a little confusing. So we have gone through and just broken down all the requirements that apply to the web for you to the AA standard. And at the end, we're actually going to talk about the additional requirements that you would need to meet AAA, but we're just going to give you the list. We're not going to actually go into each requirement. So we'll start with text alternatives. Some of you have probably heard of alt text before. And what text alternatives are is they're basically providing a text alternative for anything that isn't text. So I'll give you some examples. So if you have a photo of the Lady of Shalott, if somebody's blind, they can't really get the meaning of this. So alt text is the text that would be read in the event that the image didn't show. You can actually have your browser turn off images and it'll replace all the images with alternative text. So in this case, the alternative text says, painting of a woman in a white flowing dress sitting on a small boat. So it's pretty cool. It like allows somebody, if they couldn't see, they would have a better idea of what's going on. So text alternatives are required for all non-text content. But there are some exceptions, so controls and input. So if there's, a big button or some kind of recording device, other things, you don't necessarily have to label it the same way. There are different standards specifically for input controls. Time-based media, so sounds, videos, things, those don't need an alt text description. They need other things, which we'll talk about. If there's tests, so one example of a test is a CAPTCHA, and that's like a security requirement where you have to read you have to see an image and then type in the letters. Well, if you were to give away what the letters were, then the test wouldn't work. So that's an example. And those have accessible workarounds. Well, they will do audio tests or other kinds of visual tests that are accessible. That's a challenge. And all of you that have digital deployment sites, we have built an accessible CAPTCHA. That's why there's a little wheelchair icon next to your tests for that specific reason. Sensory data. So this is kind of interesting. Like if you, for example, wanted to have a before and after image that relied on somebody's senses to see the difference, you would need to describe both images. Like let's say it was a tree growing over time and you had 8 images of a tree that were getting bigger and bigger. It wouldn't make sense to describe each and every tree. It would drive your user with a screen reader crazy. But in that case, you can just describe the progression in the first images or in the image set. And that takes care of the requirements because you provided that person with enough information to understand what they missed. Also, CAPTCHAs, as we described, that's a form of a test that's excluded. And also images that are just used for decorative purposes but don't really affect the meaning, it's actually best to not put in alt text. And this creates some confusion because people think they've failed a test, but they actually haven't. If you have just decorative images, so you have a picture of an ocean when you're talking about a retirement plan, for example, you don't need to say a picture of the ocean because it doesn't really have any bearing to the content. It's just for decoration. So it's actually best if you leave it blank. Otherwise, you might leave the user wondering, is there something about this ocean that I need to be paying attention to? The answer is no. And we'll show some examples. The second requirement is time-based media. So this is to provide alternatives for any time-based media. Like time-based media could mean audio or video. And also an audio description track if there's something more than a talking head. So like, for example, the Olympics has designed this to be very accessible. So if you think about when you watch the Olympics, they have like a person who's narrating along, like, okay, somebody's coming up to the balance beam. They've done, and so they're constantly providing context as opposed to just showing the video. And that's actually an accessibility requirement, because if you can't see that, that audio description helps you understand what's happening if you want to participate in the Olympics. So a few examples. So this could include captions that are on the live content. So we saw that in the video that we watched earlier. And also, to click here to listen to the audio version of the video. So you would have a separate audio version if there was something that a user needed to know about this track. So it'd be something like an annotated version. It's really not, so for example, with the Water Education Foundation, which is one of our clients, if they have a video that they want to make accessible, what they can do is just have the person who's the talking head, if they say, hi, I'm here at the site of our latest legislative effort, we're here at these mountains, and describes them, then they perfectly meet this requirement without having to have an audio version. But it's just thinking about, if somebody couldn't see or they couldn't hear, can they get the essence of this video? And in most cases, just adding captions to your talking head videos is fine. If you want to go AAA, you actually have to have both subtitles, and you have to have a video in an alternative format, so such as sign language. So in this video, not only is Gary speaking, but there is a sign language person next to him that's helping to complete the audio format. Okay, the third requirement is adaptable. So this means creating content that can be presented in different ways, so without losing its information and structure. And so, basically what this means is just don't mess with your content too much. If you have the ability to, sometimes we have seen people try to make a table using spaces, and they space out all of their content, and they think it looks great on the page, but they forget about users on mobile, or they forget about somebody zooming in and then having the line breaks go crazy, and then their table doesn't make any sense because half of it's broken onto the next line. Just don't mess with it. If it's a table of content, put it in a table. If it's a bulleted list, put it in bullets. Don't do something different because you really want, Christmas trees is bullets and you want something festive for the holidays. Usually people get too caught up in the look and feel. And if you really want a custom look and feel, just send it in as a ticket so that we can help you make it have the right look and feel while preserving the accessibility. And the final one here, distinguishable. So making it easier for users to see and hear content, including separating foreground from background. There's a number of other requirements here, such as adding audio controls with the ability to change volume. So don't just have blaring sound without the ability for them to turn it down. They need sufficient contrast. There are 3 exceptions to that. Really large text doesn't have to have a certain amount of contrast. If there's decoration, that doesn't apply, or if it's part of a logo, fortunately, that is not required either. Also, resizable text. You don't need to have, as you see in a lot of sites, there's like a little plus and minus next to the letter A, to increase font size. That's actually not a requirement anymore. There's one of the procedure validations on the requirement, G124, actually said it's okay to just use the browser zoom. So you just need to make sure that your website does fine with the browser zoom. And if it doesn't, make sure that you have some kind of accessible tool. And also, no images of text. Our clients are all great about that, but we do have a few examples. So this is an example of a failure where there is just not enough contrast for users with disabilities. Here there is. There's a great tool. There's the WebAIM color contrast checker, and we can send a link to any of you that are interested in this. You could also just Google it, WebAIM color contrast checker, and you can actually test your foreground to your background, and then you can see if you pass the AA requirements or the AAA requirements. So you need a little bit more contrast for the AAA. And then again, if it's really large text, this doesn't apply. Also, this is the thing we see most commonly, is that people like to upload images with text in them. So this is the example I did with Sloan, and so this is celebrating her birthday party. And so, this wouldn't be a recommended way to do it, because people, first of all, that's so hard to read and it's so tiny. And second, if you're on a screen reader, it's going to be of no help, reading this out to you, unless you had really good alt text, but that's a little bit too much for alt text. What is the right way to do it is just use a decorative image. She likes to drink beer, so she uploaded this photo of 2 beer bottles, and that meets that requirement. Another thing that fails is, this is Microsoft Word art. We would never permit this on a digital deployment site, hopefully, but you'd be surprised. People get creative and they get excited. But this is something that a screen reader wouldn't understand, how to translate this into text and read it to a person. So they would not be able to see this. So this would fail. Just leaving, headlines as headlines. And if you want to add decoration, but don't have it replace the substantial parts of the content. There are some cases where you need to have text on an image. So an anatomy handbook wouldn't be very useful without text on the image. So this is okay. And a person with disabilities would need to find another accommodation to understand this content, because separating it just would make this meaningless. And it's not, to verbally describe the anatomy would be a challenge. So it's okay. This is exempt from the requirements. Now also let's talk about color for a second. You never want to rely entirely on color to convey meaning. So if you see here the London subway map, they have done a really careful job of adding curves to the lines so that you can follow them if you can't see color. And that's why they have the curves added the way they do, and they kind of separate the dots, is so you can still understand the lines without color being needed. So it's like a very subtle change, but it's quite cool what they've been able to attain. You also want to be careful if you have examples like this. So if you say the meetings in red have been canceled, well, if I have red cone color blindness, I can't see, these all would look black to me. So just make sure that you add additional text. So just say canceled, or use a strikeout or some other clear way to convey it. And of course, color is a great idea to use. Just don't rely solely on color to make that difference. All right, so next, keyboard accessible. So this is something that most people who don't have a disability aren't even aware of, but you actually need to be able to navigate your website entirely from a keyboard. And so this is actually kind of fun to try. So using just only the tab, space, and arrow keys, see if you can navigate around your website. You definitely can, and you can try going to your home page and clicking around and seeing. And so just as a test, try going to your home page and see if you can visit your contact page and fill out the contact form or do some other business function only using your keyboard. Also, make sure that you don't have traps that a user can't exit, like a map on a contact page. This is common. And if you do, just make sure that you exit. And like, this is why we have that contact information field in our standard model, because we place the maps in a way where they don't lead to a keyboard trap. But if you did just happen to place a Google map on your page using the embed HTML field, Escape works to hop out of it. So Google did a good job designing that, and that's something to note. This just works most of the time out of the box, but you just want to be aware of keyboard accessibility traps. And this is not something that a scanner is going to be able to test very effectively for you. So Mary asked an excellent question. Thank you, Mary, about will a screen reader convey strikeout? So yeah, okay, so you're referring to this previous example if you were to use the strikeout. That's a great point. I think some screen readers do and some don't. So it depends on that, and I have not personally tested strikeout capability, and I think it depends on how it is stricken. So that's a really good point. We actually don't have strikeout as a feature in our CMS because we weren't sure about its accessibility. So to be absolutely positive, I recommend the canceled text. Because yeah, I was thinking of visual disability, but not thinking of the screen reader impact. So better safe than sorry. And if you are looking to, if you have a specific case, I'm giving some general cases here, you're always welcome to email us and we can provide some guidance on it and we can do some research, because on the WCAG site that talks about the requirements, they actually have various examples. So we could look in strikeouts and see if there's an example of that use case. In any of these requirements, so like if we went back to, this is all requirement 1.4, we can look up 1.4 on the website, and they have a bajillion different examples of passing and failing, and examples of what they did to achieve it. So thank you. Thank you, Mary. That's a really good point. So let's see. Okay, so I think I covered a keyboard accessible. Next, enough time. So this is actually really important, providing users with enough time to read and use the content. So if you have timers, allow them to be turned off or adjusted. I don't think many of you have this problem on your websites, but there are things where, like, for example, if you're buying tickets, like if you just make sure that the system you're using, most of you use Eventbrite, Cvent, or other, kind of event management tool, which is ostensibly already taking care of this. But if you have timers, you need to allow users to turn them off or extend them. Some exceptions are real-time auctions, essential activities. That's a little bit unclear as to what that means, but you could argue that like ticket availability would be an essential activity. So again, just allowing somebody a different way, like give them a phone number they can call to buy tickets, leaving accessibility, like leaving a contact address for somebody they can contact. Just don't give them a dead end. It doesn't always have to be an equivalent experience, but it needs to be basically functional so they can still do business in a fair and just way. Also, if you have a 20-hour plus time limit, then you don't have to worry about it. You don't need to allow a 20+ hour time limit to be turned off or adjusted. For moving, blinking, or auto updating information, so like a news ticker or a carousel, allowing a way for a user to pause it is also part of the enough time clause. 2.3, so just don't design content in a way that's known to cause seizures. So this is defined as no more than 3 blinks in a 1-second period, and be especially careful with the color red. That's most likely to induce a seizure. Navigable, so this basically is just to make sure that you are following best practices around the way that users navigate. So one thing that we've seen in the past, not on our sites, but in others, is that people have like different navigation for different areas that isn't consistent. So like you go to one section and it's adding and removing some items in the navigation weren't there that were there before. So that's something that we have to keep an eye on. Also making sure that your tab order is correct. So this is mainly if you're embedding other scripts from other sites or putting things in, making sure that when users tab through things, like on a form, for example, that if your form goes first name, last name, email address, make sure the tab order is an email address, last name, first name, and that it doesn't go in a non-intuitive order. Also, make sure that users can skip blocks of repeated information with their screen reader. So like to read through the entire navigation over and over is very exhausting for a user with a disability when they're trying to hop around the page. So just make sure that you have a skip to navigation link or an ARIA landmark. If you've had your website redesigned by us in the last 3 years, we added ARIA landmarks automatically. And if you have an older site, you can check and we can make sure that we might have had a skip to nav link or we would have had some workaround, but just in case, we can make sure that that's present. You also want to make sure that your links make sense, and you just need to be careful with read more or other generic links so that the user would understand like what that links to. And we can show some different examples, but like for example, with the navigation, the way that ours tab through is it tabs through at the top level and then they can go down deeper and they can use arrows to kind of step in deeper to the navigation or just glide across the top. And what they mean by the read more example, like there isn't one here visually, but it's like if you have a big list of things and then you have kind of read more at the end of a large table, that read more might not be connected to the user might not be able to figure out what that read more was connected to. So you could say read more about this person. Read mores are by default on our teasers, but that's why we also link the titles of all of your teasers to the content, because that's what the screen reader reads. And some of the screeners will skip the read more because it's just a redundant link for visual usability. Okay, so next in the third section, third of 4, just make sure that your text content is readable and understandable. So, and this is a very simple requirement, but with AAA, there's actually, I think you have to have all of your content to a 5th grade reading level or lower. So that's really interesting, just to make sure that people, if they have cognitive disabilities, can still understand the essence of your content. I mean, I think that's a great rule no matter what you're doing, to make sure that it is very understandable, unless, of course, the content is by its nature very technical and complicated. But making sure that that things are understandable. You'd be surprised sometimes in some areas where people get right into the technical stuff without just a simple description of what it is or some basic things. A lot of times in your post structure, you take care of this by having a complex attachment with maybe some academic document, but then a simple teaser explaining what it is and what they're going to find when they download it. It's immensely helpful. Also, setting the language of your page, or for page parts if you have an alternative language. So that's very important. If you have Spanish content, that it's labeled as Spanish content and so forth. Predictable. So make sure that web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. Use an industry standard content management system. Be careful with homegrown systems. Hopefully, you as clients would never have an issue with this, but you do want to make sure that if you have your homegrown applications for in-house applications, whether it's pension or databases or other things, or if you're a school and you have application systems, like you have an old applicant database, you want to be careful to make sure that these things apply. So just make sure, don't ever let the way that a disabled user navigate the site trigger some kind of action. So don't say like, hey, hover over this to make a credit card transaction, because they might hover over it accidentally. Make sure that you have a consistent navigation and consistent website identity throughout too. And this leads into kind of input assistance. So not only do you not want to have something happen as a result of a hover or some accidental movement, you also want to help the user avoid and correct mistakes. So identifying errors in the form inputs in an industry standard way. So using web forms, making sure that the labels and instructions are on the form elements so that they're properly attached. So like using the description fields, using good error messages, those are really important. You also need to offer like suggested corrections when appropriate. And so like, select boxes and options, those are really helpful because people can choose the right one instead of needing to type it in. And then for legal, financial, or other important data, allowing the submissions to be reversible and to check it against existing data to provide the user the opportunity to correct it is really important as well. And I think this is just good practice, right? Like pre-fill content whenever possible, allowing them to fix things or edit things, and adding a confirmation page before reviewing a large submission. These are all just best practices that make sense. And now they're sort of enshrined in this input assistance. Next is compatible. So making sure that you're going to be compatible with current and future user agents. I mean, this is really interesting. Kind of when we designed things prior to mobile becoming really popular, we learned, hey, some of our clients had gone through extensive sort of extremes because they were under the direction of a print designer who really wanted sort of a pixel perfect display. And then when we rolled out mobile, they were like, eek, like this doesn't work that way at all. Okay, we have a question from Kevin. How can we check what our reading level of our website is? And is anybody else having QA issues? It looks like you got the QA issue resolved because you're able to submit that, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
okay.
Just using chat instead of Q&A.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you know what? If you are having problems with the Q&A, please feel free to use the chat feature. And I apologize if that isn't working. So yes, thank you for asking that way. To answer the question, how do we know what the reading level of our website is? That's a great question, and I don't have the answer, but I'd be happy to follow up with you individually afterward and give you that information. Okay, and then make sure that your ARIA labels are in place. And what ARIA labels are, they're little labels that go on different regions of your site to just label it. Like this is the navigation area, this is the content area. If you have a digital deployment site, this is already built into your theme, but it is important to make sure that it's there. And we definitely make sure that it is part of your site design. All right, and that's it. Just those requirements. If you wanted to go to the AAA standard, like what we're building for Disability Rights California, you would also need to deal with these requirements. So it's just about as much work, and it's really, there's lots to it. But we're not going to go into this because it's not required and it's not easily attained, and so we just. But if you were curious what the differences are, there are many. There's a big difference between AA and AAA. But like we mentioned earlier, Section 508 only requires the AA standards. All right, so now how to check. We're going to show you a tool that we like, but I just want to point out the caveat that no tool will perfectly evaluate your site for accessibility. It does, however, imply a reasonable effort to comply. It implies a reasonable effort to comply. And there are many tools and services out there. There's like Siteimprove, which is so far been too expensive even for our largest clients. But there are some organizations that like that. It will scan not only your website, but it'll check your PDFs for accessibility and other things. We're actually working on a partnership, a deal with them so that we might be able to offer it to our clients for less money because they're so hideously expensive. And we're also evaluating some other tools to kind of build into our model in the future. Your model by design is accessible, but sometimes the things you put in it are not. So, if you have scanned in a big PDF and you come from your scanner and OCR hasn't been performed on it, then it's not technically accessible. So there's just a lot of things. If you have videos that have, flashing red screens, you're not accessible. And those are things that the website isn't going to know. And ultimately, as an organization, you bear responsibility. We have, insurance, we have professional liability insurance and things to kind of help cover that. And some of our clients have requested certificates of additional insured. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with the organization to be accessible. And as your vendor and partner, we take every step we can to help with that. So that's the caveat to the tool. But now let's get into the tool because it can be pretty helpful. So, oh yeah, actually, so Heather's going to jump in and cover this part with achecker.ca.
Sure. So this one is actually very user-friendly, which is really nice. It's a free tool that you can use just by going to achecker.ca, and you're just going to paste, your website there into the web page URL, hit check it, and you're going to get a different page of options here that pops up. Oops, back one. Thank you. So as you're choosing your options here, you're just going to choose the WCAG 2.0 level AA. So you have lots of different options there, but you're just going to do the bottom middle as we're showing on the image, and then report format view by guideline. So those were the defaults that popped up when we were using the tool, but just want to double check on those. And then you're going to just check for known problems. You could go into likely and potential, but you're kind of just buying yourself some extra work right there for now. Just look at the known problems, and then that way is definitely going to get you, all of the guidelines to meet just the basics there without looking into potential issues.
Mm-hmm. And if you want, you can also check Section 508. It's not as stringent as WCAG 2.0. And if you haven't, had your website redesigned since January 18th, you could know that you're still meeting basically the federal current guidelines that apply to you. But we want to really have an eye to the future and encourage you to check against the 2.0 standards.
Sure. Now you might come back with a report that's all clean and clear, or you might come back with something that has a list of some issues. And we do find this tool does have some false positives, mostly around missing valid alt text. So in this case, if you have an image that is just decorative, it does not require a description. As Max said earlier, it could just be a little bit of a nuisance if you had an ocean described when it really didn't apply to things. So in this case, because this example image here is not vital to the story or the information that was being conveyed, you can see on the text line right above it, it says alt equals, and then it has quotes with no information in the middle. And so by putting that into the site, it's just telling the system, hey, this is a decorative image, there's no problems here, we're covered. This checker tool will read that as an error. So it's just a false positive if that's the only thing that's showing. Some sites we've done have a list of these, a number of the same error showing up. It's just something that can be skipped over.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And some of those common pitfalls that Heather gets tickets about, or common points of failure include color contrast issues. So if you have an older theme that came out prior to the modern color contrast guidelines, we might not have checked it, or there might be sections that don't have sufficient contrast. So you just feel free to email us or send us a ticket, and we will correct all of that. Of course, included in your SLA is any corrective action needed for accessibility issues that come up. The most important thing that I tell people is, like, digitaldeployment.com like has some errors on ours when we run it. And it's a result of decorative images. And I think we at one point had an input box out of order. There's little things that come up, and those scanners are constantly changing and evolving their algorithms. So you can pass one day and fail the next. The point isn't to always be 100% in compliance. It's just to make sure that if you have an issue and you become aware of it, that you take reasonable action. And if you have a user that sends in a request for an accessibility related matter, that you take care of it right away. And you're welcome to submit those as high tickets. So Mary asked, does this particular tool evaluate the entire site or just the page? This is a single page checker. So it's just looking at key pages. And we recommend that you do your home page, maybe a few of the popular pages. You don't need to scan your entire site, although you're welcome to. It would just be kind of a tedious process with that checker. What we found is that if people have scanned a few of their pages, if you've scanned one of your agenda pages, you don't need to scan all of your agenda pages because they're basically the same structure. You just want to scan a few different templates and make sure that you've done, reasonable sampling of your site. And that if you've done that and you have a copy of the scan report and you have you have documentation of the action you took around things that came up, you are way up ahead of the game. It demonstrates reasonable action. I don't think that, and while we are not lawyers and we can't give you legal advice, having worked with and come in to work with organizations that have been found even by the federal government to be in violation of certain guidelines, they were delighted just to have some basic scans run and worked with us to get some things. And reasonable action goes a long, long way, at least for now, at least this year. And being aware of this presentation, having run a scan, looked into these issues, being educated on them makes a big difference. Also, just like, and the rest of these common pitfalls include, labels on forms, not having closed captions, not having a mobile responsive site, not having semantic HTML. That's really more common with homegrown systems, not with, like, if you're using Drupal, a lot of this stuff's going to be taken care of out of the box. But if you're on an older site that isn't responsive and you have DD mobile enabled, it doesn't exactly meet the requirements. It barely meets 508, but it doesn't really meet WCAG 2.0 AA. Just too old. And so you really want to go more for mobile responsive, because DD Mobile doesn't have, you can't zoom text size on the mobile device and stuff too. So if you don't have a mobile responsive site yet, that's definitely something you want to get to be compliant with WCAG 2.0 AA, especially if you're a large organization that could have a lot of liability. Final thoughts. So just remember, accessibility goes beyond your website. It applies to PDFs, videos, and other content too. Reasonable effort definitely counts, and just take quick action. If you receive an accessibility complaint, like, most issues are politely resolved. We deal with an accessibility issue at least once a week, and it's no problem. We politely resolve it. People are just delighted because someone cares and it will take immediate action on it. So it's really it's a process. It's not a destination. And so just also consider adding a page about your accessibility policies and contact information. That goes a long way. If you have a disability-related accommodations page, like a footer link that just says, we're committed to these standards, and if you have any accessibility issues, feel free to contact this person or fill out this web form. That goes a long way to demonstrating reasonable accommodation. And that's it. We're right on the 45-minute mark, just with 1 minute to spare. And so I now like to open up for questions from all of you, and we will stay on as long as there are questions. And I want to thank you for your time today and for being, on behalf of Heather and myself and all of us at Digital Deployment, our commitment is to empower communication and help connect communities, and accessibility is a great way to do that, not only for your users, but for search engine optimization and for the users that haven't found your site yet. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for being extraordinary by coming to this very difficult and terse topic to learn more about being accessible.
Yes, and I just wanted to include that if you do use the AgeChecker website and get a report and are a little confused or would like some clarification on what any of the items mean, feel free to just save that as a PDF and send it in with a ticket, and we can help you clarify that.
All right, so questions?
No live questions right now.
All right, well, we will stay tuned for additional questions. And of course, you're welcome to send them in at support@digitaldeployment.com. And Mary, too, regarding video files and captioning, if you do have that come up, YouTube actually has some great captioning features. I haven't used it myself personally, but they do auto caption things through voice recognition and then allow you to override if needed. And another thing too, if you do have a video like a talking head that has, like if you have a talking head video and it's like a speech by a particular person and you put the speech in the text, you don't need to bother to caption the video because you provided the alternative content for it. So if you have, you know, their remarks already composed, you don't need to bother with the captioning. Okay, so descriptive links, and if this is from Veronica, and if this is related to links and content, like as opposed to not just using read more, is that what you're referring to, Veronica? Okay, yeah. So basically, a lot of people say, you know, click here, and they highlight the click here. And so when somebody's tabbing through the links to try to get to the right thing, and it reads click here, to them, they're like, click, what? And they can't like easily figure out what's around it. So if you just say, if it's Heather's bio, you could say, read more about Heather or read more about Mac, like just little things to help them navigate better. And if you're using Digital Deployment's teaser system, I understand that that is designed in an accessible way because the heading would read Heather King or Mac Clemens, and it would, like, the link would be the title of the article, so they know how to click through for reading more. And the read more is just extra. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. All right, well, with that, we're going to just go ahead and wrap it up. And we thank you again so much for attending today's webinar. Delighted